On June 5, 1897, Saint Therese said 4 of the most perplexing words she ever uttered. Her health had rapidly declined, and her physical suffering had grown deeper than ever. Her spiritual trial, which had plagued her for more than a year with temptations toward doubt and despair, continued to tell her that death would be followed by nothingness. And yet, it is in this moment, when her suffering had reached a new peak, that she says the words, "Everything is a grace." And these seemingly paradoxical words contain in them a deep lesson that, if properly practiced, has the capacity to make every practitioner a saint. But how do we begin to understand this mysterious lesson? To find the answer, we must look not to her deathbed, but to one of her greatest trials, her father's illness. And this terrible trial reveals to us 4 foundational dispositions that enabled Therese to draw good from this agonizing period. The first of these dispositions is blind trust. On April 9, 1888, Saint Therese entered the Lisieux Carmel. Her father had already suffered from a stroke and localized paralysis, but she was consoled by the fact that his care would be in her sister Celine's capable hands. However, only 2 months later, on June 23rd, this consolation was ripped away from Therese. Her father had suddenly disappeared from their home, and no one knew where he could be. With much prayer and 4 days of agonizing wait, he was finally found in the city, Le Havre, repeating that he wanted to live as a hermit. But Therese's uncle Isidore and sister Celine could both tell he was not himself. The source of his mental confusion was a combination of physical and emotional factors. He had been suffering from progressive arteriosclerosis and a serious kidney disease. On top of that, Celine and Leonie, his last daughters living with him, had told him of their eventual plans to enter contemplative religious life. During this disappearance, Therese and her sisters could only pray that he would be found. And it is in this moment of pain and confusion that Therese writes the following to Celine. "Where is Jesus? Why does he not come to console us, since we have no friend but him? Alas, he is not far off. He is here, close, looking at us, begging us to offer him this grief, this agony. He needs it for souls, for our soul. He means to give us so splendid a reward." In this moment, when it would be easy to question, why is this happening to us? Saint Therese responds instead with blind trust. Even though Jesus feels far away, she trusts that he is close. And not only that he is present, but that he is working for their good even in this suffering. It's an act of trust in God's infinite goodness. And this sort of blind trust is exactly what we as fallen humans need to recover a proper relationship with God. As the Catechism says, man, tempted by the devil, let his trust in his Creator die in his heart, and abusing his freedom, disobeyed God's command. This is what man's first sin consisted of. All subsequent sin would be disobedience toward God and a lack of trust in his goodness. Because of the sin of our first parents, our trust in God and his goodness was wounded, and this lack of trust is what causes us to struggle to follow God's commands. So restoring right relationship to God requires us to regain this trust. But Therese's journey toward blind trust was not easy. She grew up in a France that still suffered from Jansenistic ways of seeing God. Jansenism is a heresy which denies man's participation in his salvation through the exercise of his free will, and emphasizes a rigorous and fearful approach toward God's justice. And although this heresy was condemned in the 1600s, this fearful view of God still saturated Therese's environment. During her childhood, she had multiple retreats with Father Domin, all focused on the fierce justice of God, with conferences on topics including hell, the last judgment, sacrilegious communion, and mortal sin. But even in this fearful environment, Jesus was guiding Therese to trust. When she received her first communion, she was overwhelmed with his love and goodness. This experience, so different from the teachings she'd heard, was a little seed of trust planted in her. And God nurtured the little seed continually by showing Therese her own weakness and supporting her himself. When she became deathly ill as a child, she was cured through the Blessed Virgin's smile. When she struggled as a child with scruples, she received relief through prayer to her siblings in heaven. When she was hampered by oversensitivity for over a decade, God himself freed her of this infirmity on Christmas. The message? To place all her trust in God. And these first flowerings of blind trust, nurtured even more in the soil of Carmel, resulted in the complete restoration of her trust in God's goodness. And the best example of this trust is found at the very end of her autobiography, where Therese writes, "Yes, I feel it. Even though I had on my conscience all the sins that can be committed, I would go, my heart broken with sorrow, and throw myself into Jesus' arms, for I know how much he loves the prodigal child who returns to him." This blind trust allowed Therese to see God's graces as they truly are, undeserved gifts. But the next disposition allowed Therese to see even suffering as a gift of God. Embracing fire. After the triumph of a sick Louis Martin appearing at Therese's clothing day in January of 1889, his condition rapidly deteriorated. He started to hear the sounds of battle and screams of slaughter in his mind, and began to carry a revolver to defend his family. And on February 12, 1889, after finally being disarmed by Uncle Isidore, her father was placed in a mental institution. And in this moment of helplessness and suffering, Therese embraces the refining fire sent by God, saying in a letter to Celine, darling sister, far from complaining to Jesus of the cross he sends us, I cannot fathom the infinite love which has brought him to treat us so. Our dearest father must indeed be loved by Jesus to have to suffer like this." These words can be hard to understand for many. They seem so contrary to our natures, which are repulsed by suffering. But Therese sees it differently. She sees it as a sign of Jesus' love for them, a gift meant to purify them and draw them closer to God. To understand this mindset so foreign to our fallen nature, we need look no further than two of Therese's greatest spiritual influences. The first was so central to her thought that she had nearly memorized it as a child, her beloved imitation of Christ, which says, "Nothing is more acceptable to God, nothing more salutary for yourself, than that you should cheerfully suffer for Christ. For by suffering you would be made more like unto Christ." Suffering is not to be feared, but instead cheerfully embraced as the most profitable means for working out our salvation. And in the next great spiritual influence on Therese, we see that suffering serves a specific purpose in our spiritual lives. In Father Armézian's The End of This Present World and the Mysteries of the Life to Come, he says the following about suffering. "This pain, by crushing us in its grip, tears us away from love of present things. In the fire of tribulation, all the wealth and all the goods for which we yearn so ardently appear as they really are, and become in our eyes mere smoke and empty shadows." The refining fires God sends us help us detach from created things and see them as they really are. And Therese comments on the value of these refining fires in her autobiography, where she says, "Later on, when perfection was set before me, I understood that to become a saint, one had to suffer much. I understood, too, that there were many degrees of perfection, and each soul was free to respond to the advances of our Lord, to do little or much for him. In a word, to choose among the sacrifices he was asking. Then, as in the days of my childhood, I cried out, 'My God, I choose all. I don't want to be a saint by halves.'" Therese wanted to love Jesus as much as she could, but she also knew that as the fallen creatures we are, our attachments to anything but God keep us from being able to love him perfectly. But Jesus is not content with just part of our hearts. He is not content with imperfect love. He desires to free us from these attachments so we can love him fully and experience the joy of being united to him. And these attachments can only be burned away through the refining fires Jesus grants us. And so, Saint Therese, not wanting to be a saint by halves, decided to choose all, to embrace all the refining fires Jesus gave her, knowing that they were great gifts to draw her closer to him, and knowing that only through embracing these fires could she truly love him perfectly. For this reason, Saint Therese saw suffering as a gift from God, but she could only see suffering as a grace because of the next disposition: eternal focus. On March 12, 1889, a full month since her father had been placed in a mental institution, things hadn't improved. Her sisters, Leonie and Celine, were now further separated from those in the convent, staying in a monastery in Caen to be close to their father. And yet, back in Lisieux, gossip had been circulating about their father's decline, and these rumors even spread from town into the convent and were discussed in front of Therese. Perhaps the most bitter of these rumors was the speculation that Louis Martin's mental decline was caused by Therese leaving home. But with all the pain of this present life before her, Therese focused instead on the eternal reality, writing to Celine, "This evening, I feel a need to plunge with my Celine into the infinite. Life passes, eternity comes to meet us with great strides. Soon, we should be living with the very life of Jesus." For Therese to bear with the sufferings of life, she needed a perspective not focused on this present world, but instead looking to eternity. And in doing so, she was following the teaching of St. Paul from 2 Corinthians, where he writes, "For this slight momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, because we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal." Therese didn't focus on the things seen in this present life, but the unseen things of eternity, and especially her focus was on heaven, which was for her the guiding light that put all present sufferings in context. And her deep longing for heaven was most strongly cultivated by reading the end of this present world. In fact, this next passage was so influential on Therese that she quotes it 5 times when writing to Celine during their father's illness. "The Lord cannot forget that the saints, when they once lived on earth, paid homage to him by the total donation of their whole being. In his gratitude, God exclaims, 'Now it is my turn. The saints have made me the gift of themselves. Can I respond other than by giving myself without restriction or measure? If I bring my servants and friends into my house, if I console them and make them thrill with joy by enfolding them in the embrace of my charity, this satisfies their thirst and their desires superabundantly, and is more than the perfect repose of their hearts requires. But it is not enough for the gratification of my divine heart. For the perfect satisfaction of my love, I must be the soul of their souls. I must penetrate and imbue them with my divinity. I must unite myself to them face to face, eternally, by showing myself to their spirits undisguised and unveiled." This eternal joy, loving perfectly and being loved perfectly, was what Therese longed for. And in the context of this joy, the passing sorrows of this life seemed well worth the reward. And recognizing God's eternal plan for her, even in suffering, helped Therese to see the great graces God was granting her. And Therese received these gifts with our next disposition: unconditional thanks. On May 12th of 1892, after Uncle Isidore had brought his brother-in-law home, Therese and her Carmelite sisters were able to see their father again for the first time in 4 years. But 39 long months in an asylum had changed their dear father. Once so sturdy and dignified, he had become gaunt and had declined cognitively, now nearly mute and only speaking in short, common phrases. The meeting was heartbreaking for Therese. As their father left them with tears in his eyes, he pointed upwards and managed to say, "In heaven." His words would prove true. This was the last time Therese saw her father. But it is even in sufferings like this that Therese saw the opportunity to thank God as she prayed in her act of oblation to merciful love. "I thank you, O my God, for all the graces you have granted me, especially the grace of making me pass through the crucible of suffering." In both trial and joy, Therese saw the opportunity to thank God, and this unconditional thanks is exactly what all Catholics are called to practice. That's why so often in the Mass, the priest prays, "It is truly right and just, our duty in our salvation, always and everywhere to give you thanks, Lord, Holy Father, Almighty and Eternal God, through Christ our Lord." We're called to give thanks always and everywhere, because in every circumstance, God is sustaining us and has given us everything we have. And when thanks comes from a place of poverty, it is brought to its perfection. It becomes an act of surrender and of grateful trust in God's providence. Saint Therese puts it beautifully in her autobiography. Jesus does not demand great actions from us, but simply surrender and gratitude. In moments of trial, in our weakness and poverty, we often can't offer great actions, but we can offer a heart that thanks even when it doesn't understand. And this internal act to thank God even in our weakness and confusion is what He really wants from us, because these internal acts are how we give Him our hearts. They allow us to say with Jesus, "Not my will, but thy will be done." They allow us to say with Job, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And this is perhaps the hardest thing for us to do in moments of suffering, when all our present life seems to be pressing down upon us. But Saint Therese shows us we don't need to be perfect, we just need to do our best. One time, When she had a severe fever and terrible thirst, the infirmarian applied treatments that made her even hotter, prompting Therese to complain. "My Jesus, you are my witness. I am burning, and they bring me still more heat and fire. Ah, if only I had in place of all this a glass of water. My Jesus, your little girl is very thirsty. However, she's happy to find the opportunity of lacking what is necessary in order to resemble you better and to save souls." We see by Therese's example that we don't need to be perfect. We can be honest in our prayer and even complain to God like she did here. But when we realize what we're doing, we, like Saint Therese, have the choice to see how our current situation is a gift from God and thank Him. The terrible trial of her father's illness helped Therese cultivate the 4 dispositions that illuminate her 4 mysterious words. That day, on June 5, 1897, she was so convinced of her approaching death that she said to her sister Pauline, "Little mother, it's you who prepared me for my first communion. Prepare me now for my death." And it is in this place, on death's door, amidst her great trial of faith, that Therese said to Pauline, "If you find me dead one morning, don't be troubled. It is because Papa, God, will have come to get me. Without a doubt, it's a great grace to receive the sacraments. But when God doesn't allow it, it's good just the same. Everything is a grace." Grace is God's free and undeserved help, a gift that draws us to Him and prepares us for eternal life. So when Therese says these words, she is recognizing the gift that God is giving her. By trusting blindly in God's goodness, embracing His refining fires, focusing on the eternal, and thanking Him for all He gave her, Therese could see that everything, even suffering, was a grace. So let us follow after this little soul and great saint. Let us throw ourselves into the arms of Jesus, full of blind trust. Let us say, "I choose all," and embrace each refining fire God sends as a gift to purify our love. Let us focus on the unseen things of eternity, knowing the joy God desires to give us. Let us thank the God who gives us everything, always and everywhere. Let us always be at peace, knowing with our whole hearts that everything is a grace.